So it records my audio as well. Yeah, you get to listen to all my terrible jokes. They're immortalized forever on the internet. So that's always awesome. I had some good ones. Some Raiders of the Lost Ark quotes last time. It was nice. Okay, so anyways, desktop, Django admin, start project. Let's say record haters. That's what we're going to call it. All right. That's way cooler with a Z. And let's cd into it, record haters. And I can see my inner project folder, my manage.py. I'm going to make my apps folder. And guys, I'm going to kind of burn through this initial setup, just FYI. I'll talk about what I'm doing, but I'm just going to mob through it because the idea at this point is that we should be able to start these projects. Creating my init.py file inside my apps folder, calling up a level to my manage.py, telling it to start my app, haters. All right, seeing it, cding into it, creating my urls.py, creating a templates directory, cding into said directory, creating another haters folder to differentiate, and then I start to look at, in comparison to the wireframe, I'm going to need an index.html. I'm also going to need some sort of edit.html. I'm going to need some sort of main page, so I could say main.html. I can't think of anything else right now, but I at least like to get those initial pages up, right? And ls cd back into haters for a second. Just make sure I got my urls py. All right, so I'm looking good. So code dot load everything up. Alrighty, so let's get this going. And I like to just test my server first before I worry about anything else. So I'll get started doing that. My settings.py. Pull that up a little bit. Can you guys see okay? Alright, so apps.haters. Don't forget our comma. Tim's the guy. Tim knows that error. So he's our go-to. Not during the exam, though. Alright. I'm very disappointed in our bug board. It was extremely short. apps.haters.urls. Again, directing all traffic to my application, essentially. And I need to make sure on this URLs I import include, because I'm using it right here. After that, I'm pretty much done with this file. Open my app, open haters, hop into my urls.py, and I go ahead and place my URLs. I essentially copy and paste there, because the structure is pretty much the same. I can just repurpose it a little bit. So I don't have include here. I actually close my route here for the index route, and I'll call on a views.index function that has yet to be created. I'll leave this tab up and hop into my views. I will make sure for now I import an HTTP response so I can see what's going on and create a single function that just returns that HTTP response. So yeah, not that awesome, right? And let's try to run it. Views is not defined. So what did I do, guys? What did I miss? Forgot to import my views and my URLs, right? From dot import views. Views is not defined. It's talking specifically about the URL, right? That broke it. So from dot import views. And we can see our server running just fine. Cool. So let's open a new tab. Local. And the HTTP response worked. So we're at least getting something back, right? Which is our first step. If you don't have your server running first, I would stop before you do models, before you do anything else. Just get it running. And now that we know we're running, we're good to go. So I can get rid of the HTTP response, and I'll swap this out for a render, sending my request, as well as the specific page I want to render, which is in templates, in haters, and I'm talking about index.html, right? Haters, index.html. No context necessary, because what is this index page most likely in my system? It's going to be my login and registration page, right? So I don't really need to send any context up there, but we'll get started on that. So when I talk about getting started, this is when I would look at the wireframe. Now that I know my project set up properly, I would look at the wireframe and say, okay, what are my forms? Usually my forms are going to be a good indication as to what data I need to contain, right, or store. So I would look at login reg, and I'd see something like the first name, last name, date of birth, email, password. I'd see something like that. I'd look at record and see, the fields that exist there, which obviously right now with our wireframe, it's a little lacking in those departments. So we'll just kind of imagine that we're looking at these sort of repeated data pieces across the entire site, right? So in terms of the belt reviewer, you have books that you can see. You've got authors that you can see. You can see a couple forms. One form is a little tricky because it shows you a ton of fields, and it depends on how you model it. So you can go about different ways of modeling that assignment. I think the easiest is to split them up, but you can have it technically as just an author on a book. But so this is where I would just look at the wireframe and kind of figure out what we want to do. So we already had our little models defined there. So let's get started. And after I finish my models, I'll field some questions, okay? So class, we know for sure we're going to have a user, and inheriting from models.model. And in this class, we're going to have a first name, models.char field, and a last name and an email, and even a password, actually. All going to be exactly the same. First, last, email, password, date of birth, dob, models dot, what kind of field should it be? Datetime field, right? Datetime field. And what else do we have? First, last, email, password, date of birth. Created that and updated that, right? All right. And let's go ahead and do a little bit of this.
I have a general question about this too.
Yep.
It seems standard practice to add on every table.
Yep.
So within the Django web, it's all automatically create entities, so why doesn't it just automatically create those two as well?
Because you don't necessarily need them. They're just good extra data for us to pretty much always have.
So you still keep it optional.
Yeah, they still keep it optional. It's not built in there yet, but it's good for us to know when we touched, when we modified, when we created these things.
I was just thinking.
Yeah, certain frameworks require it. So if you're modeling your DB elsewhere, for instance, if you're creating a SQL DB and then you're just connecting to it from a framework, certain frameworks require that it exists. Django doesn't, but for us, it's still best practice just to put it there. Yeah. What's up, Kevin?
How do you make your VS code so colorful?
This is a little preferences style thing to make it look like Atom, because I came from Atom. I like Atom a lot. So you can even swap the keyboard shortcuts to make it all Atom shortcuts. So yeah, but you can just Google that, like VS Code style change or something like that.
Okay.
So first name, last name, email, password, date of birth, create at and updated at. That seems pretty fair for my user, right? I don't think we need anything else there. Class record, we said, models.model. And for record, what did we say we had? We had an artist, Artist, and models.char field, max length equals 255. Now, if we were making this a pretty complex system, would artist be something that we'd want to put inside of just the record? No, right? We'd probably have an artist be an altogether different table, and we'd just reference it with a foreign key. We're trying to focus more on having a couple relations before we throw a bunch in there, so we'll stick with just the one foreign key, one many-to-many right now. But ultimately, data normalization, you'd want to have this artist be its complete own entity, right? They could have had many records. They could have, been formed in this year, disbanded in said year. It just depends on how much data we want about that thing. For us, we're not going to really care too much about the artist other than who they were. Album, we'll say it's a models.char field, max length also equal to 255. Label, we could do that. The record had a label, right? Just another models.char field, max length 255. And uploader equals, and just to let you guys know, the way I usually tackle this is I seriously just put every single normal column first. Then I start to consider my relations, right? So now it's where I would say, okay, so I want every record on the system to have someone who uploaded it, someone who's apparently selling this thing, right? So uploader is a models dot what? Foreign key, right? Models dot foreign key to the table user. The related name, again, for the related name, what I do is I consider what the query would be coming from the related table. If I wanted to get all of the records by a specific user, starting in the record table, I would do something like record.objects.filter, give me a filtered set of records where the uploader, because the column on that table that we started with, where the uploader was equal to a specific user. So that would give me all the records uploaded by a user. Now, if I considered what that same query would be from the related table, if I had some related name, I would say something like user.objects.first, say we care about the first user, dot what? Dot what word describes all the records they've uploaded?
Uploaded records.
Dot uploaded records. That's perfectly fair. Or dot uploads. You know, something like that. But that's how I start to think, what should my related name be? It can be anything, but it's always good to consider the query, and then the query can kind of lead you to a reasonable name. You can still make it work with a stupid name, but it just might hurt your brain as you're going. So the uploader is a foreign key to the user table, the related name being uploads. So now user.objects.first.uploads.all. That seems pretty, you know, verbose. It seems pretty explanatory. And we also had haters, right? Oops, I meant to do it with an S. Models dot many to many, right? Also to which table? User. We can have any number of relations between two tables. The related name being hated records, right? User.objects.first dot hated records dot all, right? Something like that. So in this way, we have our models established. I'm thinking they look pretty good. They're not set in stone. We can always go through permutations, right? We can always make changes. But in order to make these actually work within my system, what do I absolutely have to do?
Migrate.
Migrate, right? I have to make my migrations and then migrate. Questions so far? What's up?
The class user,
Uh-huh.
you know, the date of birth. And so I noticed that a lot of times whenever we have an empty parenthesis,
Mm-hmm.
is it always standard just to put in there like the null equals true? That way we don't get the nasty bug later on?
I put the null equals true if it tells me to put the null equals true. You know, I give it a shot first without anything inside. If it comes back and says, hey, you absolutely have to have some sort of thing or null, that's when I'll modify it. Date time field, I think it does need something there. So I'm thinking it's going to break, but we'll see here in just a second.
Because the way I think it is, like, if I'm doing the test and I'm trying to avoid any...
Any potential bugs?
Is it safe just to do it?
Well,
just in
let's
case?
just double check. We would look at Django model fields reference. And when we get to Django model field reference, we can check out what the required arguments are for each of these. We can look up date time field. And date time field, max digits none, decimal places none, options. So, oh, decimal field. There we go. Auto now false, auto now add false, options. So it doesn't look like we need it. So let's see what happens when we try to make our migrations, but I'm thinking it's an optional. But we'll see shortly, right? So, any other questions regarding what we've done so far? Setting up the project, really just getting it spun up and responding with an HTTP response, just to make sure it's working. We've not connected anything else, and we have one page that we're hoping to render, but we really haven't even gotten that far. All we're saying is, hey, these are my models. This is how I design. It's not how you guys have to do it, right? You can do anything you want in whichever order, but I do this because this is the way I tackle every Django project. I just have a system. So whatever your system is, just be consistent, right? Cool. So let's try to make our migrations. Cool. Looks like it made everything just fine. All right. So yeah, we don't have a required, yeah, there for sure. So Python manage py run server, and we're back up and running with no more error. Our models are now defined. We can get started doing something. And the something I said we're going to start with is the login and registration, right? So let's get our HTML going, and let's set up a nice, disgusting form here that looks very ugly. Record store. And let's say our H3 is register. And let's set up our form. So I don't have the URL defined yet, but I'll say that this will go to a register URL. Or if you want to be fancy, you can go to a process/reg and then have the login be a process/log and just differentiate with the URL parameter. You know, whatever works for you. But I'm going to say it's going to go to the register URL, and the method is going to be post. And make sure we get our csurf token in there. All right, so we're looking good. I'm going to go ahead and say something. What's up, Brennan?
Isn't post supposed to be capital letter?
Doesn't matter in the HTML.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, HTML is pretty loosey-goosey as far as those rules. You have to have it, Otherwise, it'll default to a GET, but it does not have to be capitalized up here.
Okay.
In the server, on views.py, it definitely needs to be capitalized. That's its name. But here, it doesn't matter. If you want to be consistent, though, you can do it. So we have a first name and an input type text. Name is equal to, oops, I don't want to do that. First name. And dump a couple of those. Last name. What did I keep misspelling in the one of those videos? I kept misspelling the same thing over and over and over and over. I forget. First, last, email, type text. So here's something too. If you guys are doing a type email, yes, your HTML technically made sure it was an email, but that's not how we'll be grading validations on the exam. We'll be grading validations based on if you did an email regex validation. I understand it does effectively the same thing for you, but at the end of the day, it's more the concept of sending this data to the server and validating that data in your server using Python logic. We want our HTML typically to be as stupid as possible. We want our server to be as smart as possible. Because the HTML we kind of want to do in a manner where that's not blocking anything. It's just simply how the viewer or how the user sees something. When you get into front-end frameworks, it'll still be a layer apart from the HTML. You'll still have the HTML, but then you'll essentially have all of your AJAX happening, understanding what the HTML is, but then doing the validations there. But ultimately, the HTML at the end of the day, we want that to be as sort of simplistic and just HTML as possible. So just do an input type text. We can still check for an email based on email regex, right? So email, and we'll say email. So we have first name, last name, email. What else do we have? Date of birth. So let's say birthday. And input type date. And name. And what else do we have? First, last, email, password. And a confirm password. And lastly, a submit, right? That should be it. All right, let's see. What's up?
So instead of p tags to like go down lines,
Mhm.
I use BR.
Yeah,
Is that okay?
both of these are pretty hacky, to be quite frank. You shouldn't really use BR tags. You shouldn't really be using P tags. If we were doing this based on style, what you should do is have these things.
Yeah.
With your style sheet, you make them block elements, and then you just line them up.
Yeah, but like for now, right?
I'm not gonna, yeah, if I see a BR, it's okay.
Even for the exam, right?
It's fine for the exam. But be aware, if an employer sees a BR tag or what I'm doing here with P tags, they're not gonna really be fans of that. If you guys are doing something based on style, you want your HTML to just be explicit HTML, and you want your style to be the style. BR tags, P tags, I'll accept it. I've said that this is kind of a hack before too, but ultimately you would then just style these out, make them block elements, and make them line up. Yeah, but that'll be okay. So dob, email is email. Let's see, password, that's what we want. And password, oops, lowercase p, and confirm password. And I'll just call it C password. Notice for most of these, I just kept the names the exact same way I had them as my columns, just because that's more clear to me. If you want to differentiate names, that's okay, but sometimes it can be confusing juggling that many names at a time. So what I do is I just keep it exactly the same, obviously other than the confirm password. It doesn't exist in my model. Let's double check. First name, last name, email, date of birth, password, confirm password, and we have this input type submit. So it looks like our registration form. And let's make our login as well. We want to make sure our method is post there. And inside, make sure we get our cserv. And we can actually just grab a couple of these guys. It's the lower portion, email, and password, and login. So going to login via the post method with its email, its password, and login. Cool. So I'm thinking if we refresh right now, we've got our login and registration page, right? Nothing happening. These are both going to break. You didn't find register. You didn't find login. So, of course, I'm going to start with register first because I want to get data in the system. Any questions so far? Cool. Just HTML, right? That part should be pretty okay by now. Now, I understand I'm going fast through a lot of these concepts, but that doesn't mean I don't want you to ask questions. If you need to ask questions, now's the time to ask them. Don't be shy, right? The exam's in 2 days. I want to make sure that we get everything out. But let's get into it, right? So let's go ahead and say that we're going to go to a register, and I'll call one of views .register. I can throw a $sign there. You don't have to necessarily if we don't have anything register / this, that, and this. We don't have to put a $sign, but you can. And just to stop it, only register is allowed through. So it's going to go to views.register, which we'll create now. Def register, taking in a request. Now we want to do our checks as well. If the request.method does not equal a post method, then we want to tell the user, hey, you're not allowed to be here. You don't have the data required anyways. So before I try to access request.post, I'm going to kick you back out. Return, redirect. Where should I redirect the user to? Back to index, right? If they're not, making a post request, then redirect them back to index. And we have to make sure we import a redirect. So we can even try that. Let's see, return, redirect. And let's just throw a print statement to make sure this is working properly. Print, hey, that wasn't a post. So let's see if we can get that print statement to actually go. Nothing here currently. But if we try to do a GET request to the /register, we'll see that nothing happened, but it'll tell us, hey, that wasn't a post. So we're already building in that functionality to check. Now the beautiful thing is that once we check this once, it's the same check every time, right? Just like checking for a user in session. Same check every time. So we can reuse that. So if the request method isn't post, kick them back. Otherwise, let's print the request.post to see if we got all of our data. Oh gosh. It's supposed to be a refresh. There we go. So we'll get some values in here. All right, make sure we get all those values printed out. And we can just make sure all of our fields are coming back. We have a first name, a last name, a date of birth, the middleware token, which is our CSRF token, a password, an email, and a confirm password. So now I'm certain I've got my data, which is now when I would start my validations. But before that, we're just kind of shooting in the dark if we're not certain our data's there. But if we have our data, now is where we start our validation block, right? And you might be wondering, well, why are you doing this all in views if we're going to eventually translate it to models? Again, I'd rather you focus on getting it to work first at all than focus on splitting it up between files and doing extra work on top of getting it to work. So we'll put it here, then I'll show you how we can just easily move it. So validations, some standard ones, length checks, right? If the len of the request.post, again, the way I access my values in that dictionary, thing I just printed out, at first name, if the len of that thing is less than 2, then I'll say something like messages.error is equal to, or not even equal, but I'll create a messages.error. Now, messages is a module that exists in Django that works just like Flash. So I'll have to import it from django.contrib, import messages. But once I have it, I'm essentially creating Flash messages that I can then show my user. So I'll say if the len of the request.post at first name was less than 2, then we'll say, hey, you've got an error. First name must be 2 or more characters. And I can do pretty much the same check for the last name too, right? If we're just saying it has to be 2 or more. Now when you guys get the exam, it's going to be any number, right? It'll just tell you it has to be 8, it has to be 12, it has to be this or that, right? So just be prepared. This isn't an end-all, be-all of validations. They can range. So if the len of the request.post at first name was less than 2, or the last name was less than 2, and I can then check if the len of the request.post, maybe you want to check if the password was 8 or more characters. Then I'll say, hey, messages.error, you need a better password. And we'll say password must be 8 or more characters, 28 or more characters. Geez, that's quite a beefy password. We also want to check to see if our passwords are the same, right? If the request.post at the password does not equal the request, and we don't need the len check on that, whoops. Now it's just checking to see if the password is the same as the confirmed password, right? .post at C password. if they're not the same, another error. Passwords must match. Or telling the password doesn't match. Validations on the birthday, let's just do for the time being, and we'll go further with the birthday in a second. But one thing that's peculiar about that date field on HTML is that it will actually still send birthday through, but it won't actually, if we do this real quick, we can see register. We'll see some errors. There's nothing that's going to get printed out. Oh, I took out the print request.post. Let's print it again real quick. Print request.post. And if I print the request.post, you'll see that just like every other input type, date of birth is also coming back, number one, as a Unicode string. It's not actually numbers, it's a string. And number two, it's coming back as an empty string. So before I worry about validating this date, making sure the date's good or within a certain range or something like that, I want to make sure the date exists there at all. So I can do a len check essentially on the date of birth because it's still coming back as a string. The request dot post. I keep dumping that uppercase T. If that is less than, or if it's equal to 0, we can say. If it's equal to 0, we can also generate another message. Date of birth or birth date required. Now, this would all, what's up?
If you have a string and then you have you compare it to an integer, is that a problem?
Yeah, absolutely. That's the thing is like when this comes back, it's not going to be the data type. Whenever we've tried to work with strings and integers together, cannot concatenate string and int. You know, string 5 equaling number 5 is not going to work, or int 5. So this would be the area, essentially an else for this one if statement. What does this else mean right now? That it wasn't equal to 0, right? That there was something there for the birth date. So this would be where I'd check range or something like that, right? Is it less than today? Is it greater than today? Something like that. Print, it's there. It'll make me put something. I could put a pass, I guess. So the only if statement that actually gets an else would be if we wanted it to do basically like a further check, right? So if it wasn't there, do this. Otherwise, it is there. We're certain it's there. Do this instead. Or I could even do the opposite. I could say if the length of the date of birth is greater than 0, then I'd put my if statement here, my range check in here. Just depends on how you're going about it. You can, if statements, you can kind of get away with negating them or just doing the positive check. If the length is 0, kick them out. Otherwise, print it's there. So let's see, we're checking the length on the first name, the last name, the password. We're checking to see if the passwords match. We're checking to see if they put a date of birth. Is that all of our inputs? What's up, Tim?
How would you encourage that? Take the Unicode so you can compare it to a date range.
We are going to do that, but I just want to get through the rest of the process, and we'll circle back to that. So that's why I'm going to check this. This will be a to-do, right? But we will do that. No, you're okay. Yeah, you're good. So right now we have a way to check all of these things. First, last password, the confirm password, checking to see if they're the same. We don't necessarily need a length on the confirm password because there's no way we get through validations with a length of less than 8, the password being 8. It wouldn't work, right? So we're okay there. Any questions on these validations in general before we get into a specific validation or before we decide we actually want to make something when we know our data is good?
So just kind of for a clarification, the idea is when you do these validations, it's like it goes through each one of these, and then once it goes through all those and everything, okay, that's when it renders your site or redirects.
There's one extra step, but that's exactly it, right? That's after all of our validations is then when we want to start talking about what can I put in my DB. But if I put something in my database arbitrarily at the beginning, and then I validate my code or validate the data, I mean, did I validate for any reason at all at that point in time? No, right? I mean, I just put it there. It's too late. I could essentially find it and remove it, but do our validations first, scrub our data, make sure it's good, and then when our data is good, do whatever else you need to do. So I mentioned this in the video too, and I've mentioned it when we've worked with validations, but the peculiar thing is that even though this loads up this cache, or essentially this session that holds on to these error strings, when I finally get down here in my code, do I know if any of those actually got triggered? No, right? I can't just know. So what's a way that I can build in or put something somewhere that'll allow me to understand at this point in time whether any of those validations actually triggered. We could put them in a dictionary. We could do something like that. I think, honestly, the easiest way is just to set a Boolean. We've talked about this, too. Just set some Boolean saying the error is false, and then for each of these, we can say, hey, we had an error. It was true, right? So for each one of these, again, if one gets triggered, it's true at the end of this whole block. If all 10 of them get triggered, it's still going to be true, right? It doesn't matter, but we know at least one of them failed. So that would allow us to finally do a check at the bottom to say, hey, if this is true, that means what? There was an error. If it was false at that point, it means we're good, right? So we put this error equals true essentially in all of these guys. I mean, you could load up a dictionary with some data, but it's honestly too much because you've already done all the error validations, right? You've already created these messages somewhere. We're finally just checking, basically, what's the state of this Boolean? It's only false if none of these got fired. And of course, we'll have one more, possible assignment here for our other validation, our range validation. So finally here, we can do another check. If error, and I don't have to say if error equals true, but just simply if error, it is literally true or false. If true, return, redirect back to the index. Else, or in fact, I don't even really need an else, right? Because we're returning regardless. So else, I can print, it's all good, man. And then we can return, redirect back to the index. We're just going back to the index regardless right now because I haven't bothered with another URL or page, etc., right? So we have our way to check all of these things. Date specifically we'll get to in just a second. But right now, as it stands, this is going to redirect me to index both ways, or both possibilities, right? Error or no error. But if I do a little trick, I can actually see those error messages that I loaded into memory. I have to do this kind of weird Jinja statement. If messages, and we throw an end if, for message in messages, and our end for, and we can just make a little key tag that has our message inside. Just message, right? For message in this list, print the message out. So let's see if this works right now. Oh, we saw something flash there for a second. I register. First name must be 2 or more. Last name must be 2 or more. Password must be 8 or more. Birthday required. Passwords don't match. Looks like everything actually worked, right? We checked the length of the first name. We checked the length of the last name. We checked the length of the email. Checked the length of the birthday. Password. Password. No messages back. And actually, for us, for the time, oh wait, we got our printout, right? So first, we knew that the date was there. That was the previous one that actually had all the errors. Then we knew, hey, again, the date's there, but hey, we pass all of our validations. It's all good. So finally, where's the safe block of code where I can determine I should create this user? Line numbers. After 37, right? Right here, basically at this point in time, on 39 down. But I mean after 37, after we've determined that check, right? So now I could do my create statement. Now to talk specifically about a validation that someone asked me was the birthday. How can I understand, for instance, if it's less than today or something like that? So we talked a moment ago about how when it's coming through in the post, we get a Unicode string that represents the date the user entered, right? But it's still a string. So we need to translate the string into Python code. And it gets to what Ed was talking about. Can we just compare a string to a number? No, we can't, right? I can't compare first name to a number or whatever Unicode string. So we have to turn a Unicode string into a Python date object. So when you guys hit something like this, turn string into Python datetime object. You'll find some Stack Overflow most likely. You'll also find some blog posts about it probably. This one seems like a good one. And it's going to talk to you about something called stirp time. The way stirp time works is it takes in a string, and based on the format of that string, will turn it into a Python date object. Now there's also stirf time, and it almost does the opposite. It takes a date and turns it into a formatted string. So stirp time and stirf time are the ways that we can basically interact with strings and datetime objects. So we have the process, or we have the dilemma of having what? We have a string or a datetime. We have a string. We want to turn that string into a datetime. So let's start to do everything real quick. Let's even just dump. Well, we can check all those regardless. But let's say that when we're sure we have our date, which is in this else block, right? If you try to run a date format on something that's not there, what do you think is going to happen? If you try to turn something into a date and it's not there, what do you think is going to happen? It's going to break, right? So we only do the date format check and turning into a date when we're sure it's there in the first place, which is why we decided we were going to do it in the else block, the else related to this if statement, right? Now that I've ensured I have a date, I can say something like my bday equals the request.post at dob. So that's just still going to be the string. In order to use that stirp time, we say from datetime, so from the Python datetime library, import datetime. You like that one. So from datetime, import datetime. Now, when we want to use this, we can refer back. We can say, okay, they're calling datetime.stirptime. So let's implement that. Let's say my bday is not simply the request.post at dob, which is just a string. Let's say it's datetime.stirptime. Given that string, here's the peculiarity. You also then write the sequence that these dates will actually be formatted. So in order to understand that sequence, sometimes it's worth it just to say, hey, print datetime.today, just so we can see what's happening. And let's see what kind of sequence we need in order to do a proper comparison. So let's go ahead and try to go through our validations again. Whoops, I needed it to actually be there in order to get what I wanted printed out. Stirp time takes exactly 2 arguments. I thought I commented it out. Well, that's weird. Interesting. Must have not refreshed. All right, let's get a date there. I think I went back. Yeah, always be careful when you go back. Make sure you actually refresh your page. Now, if I go down, I can see that this is what today looked like, datetime.today. So I'll grab that, and I'll throw it up here as a little reminder of like, hey, this is the general format I want. I really don't care about the time, but I definitely care about the days. And this is in the format year, month, day. So I'll have to specify. When I say my bday is equal to datetime.stirptime, it takes 2 arguments. It takes the thing to turn into a datetime, and it also takes a string representing the format. This is where it gets a little weird. So something that's good, stirftime reference, I think it's called. Stirftime.org. So stirftime and stirptime both take the same characters as far as how they would format or turn this into a specific date. So we're looking for year, month, day. Year dash month dash day. So let's see what we can find. Year without the century, year with the century, that's what we want. So it looks like percentage capital Y, okay. Dash.
Can we refer to the assignment that we had?
You can refer to any of your code, I don't care. Any of your code that you have that you've done this before, refer to it, yeah. During the exam, it's open internet, open notes. The only thing you can't use is if you happen to find an exact copy of the exam. I will know, number 1. And number 2, please don't do that. That is grounds for dismissal without a refund. Like, no joke. Yeah, don't do that. We've had cheaters before. So, and at the end of the day, as silly as it sounds, honestly, like in the university, like I get if you cheat, you get your degree. That's, you know, fantastic. No one's gonna know. If you cheat here, you're not gonna know the stuff that you need to know, right? You're not gonna be able to do the job effectively. So please don't cheat, guys. I don't like that conversation. So we want the year, right? The 4-digit year. We want the month padded with a 0, it looks like. So make sure we get that. Let's see. As a 0 padded decimal number, so it looks like a percentage capital M. Now be careful, be very specific, because the casing does matter, as you can see, right? We have capital M, we have a dash M, lowercase y, and then we wanted the day.
And then as padded decimal, capital M.
Oh wait, that was minute, huh? Oh yeah, whoops.
Month is,
Month is, there we go. The month is the B, I always forget. Or the M, lower M, right? B is the month names. So month, lower M. And then we want the day of the month as a 0 padded decimal. Is it 0 padded? What do we have, 18? Try the percentage D. All right, so let's say that my B day is datetime.stirp time of the request.posted DOB, which was what came through with the post, and we're saying it's in this sequence. What's that?
Why does the D color like that? Does that happen on mine too? Is that just
I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. I couldn't tell you. Let's do
specifically the D that does it?
yeah, just that first letter at that point in time. I'm not sure what that means. Yeah, I don't know.
Looks like it's a gives it values.
Yeah, I mean the coloring is not based on the language as much as it's based on how your editor is interpreting what you're doing. So it might just not understand a sequence of percentage, then a dash, then another percentage, then another dash. It might just get tripped up by it. So the colors can be very beneficial at times, but it can also be things that just it's your editor more than anything. Just like Pyland. Yeah. So let's see. So let's print my B day and see if we get that to work properly. Not trying to do any comparison yet, not trying to do anything with it other than to see if I got a date time created. It didn't break. That's a good indication. So I got the date time today, then I got our date time, and it was there, right? We know it was there for sure. Let's get rid of the it's there. Now, do you think I could do a less than? Is this less than today? Let's try it, right? So let's say something like print my B day less than today. And let's make a variable. Today is equal to datetime.today. So I'm just going to print the result of this conditional, right? This is essentially saying if my, I'm just printing the result, right? If my B day is less than today, we expect it to print true. If it's not, we expect it to print false. So let's see what we get. Let's put a date there. Let's put a couple years from now. It didn't error out. False. My B day was not less than today. Let's try it as something last year. My B day is less than today. So that's obviously turning it into the stirp, turning it into the date time object. That's the biggest key. That's the biggest piece, right? But then we can do things like print my B day dot year, print my B day dot month, and we can access those values. Today's what, the 18th, and 2018, and we got a true because it doesn't have our timestamp. So today is an okay day according to our system. So just be aware if you're looking for it being less than today right now without a time, it's an okay day. It's okay, honestly, depending on the system. Like someone's birthday could literally be today, and they're hours old, and they're registering for our website. I don't know why that situation's happening, but it could happen, right? So that's all right. But check it out. We got the year, we got the month, so we can access any one of those things. Cool? So any string that looks like this, that looks like a date time, if we specify the sequence that we need to turn that string into, some sort of date time object, we take in basically the string, we specify the sequence, and it'll generate a date time for us. When we have that date time, just like when we've turned a string into an int, then we can do the real comparison. Well, we can't do the comparison from a string to a date time. We can't do the comparison from a string to an integer. It might even let you, like the string int comparison, I'm sure everyone enjoyed that bug for Great Number Game, right? Where it's like, why is this true every time, That's one of those things that just, it'll happen. It'll happen again and again and again. But go back to basics. Is this the right data type? Am I doing a real comparison? It'll let you get away with it, and you don't know why it's working the way it is. All right. So does that answer some of the questions about how we would check dates, how we would, make sure something is within a range or good? Obviously, you can take this logic much further. You can say if it's, less than today, or if the delta between these years was 18 or something like that. Kevin, come on. All right, so we're good there. And I can do something like if, finally, and if my b-day is less than today, or if my b-day is greater than today, then I'll say that that's an error. Messages.error, sending it the request again, sending it can't time travel. Dude. Right? So something, an error equals true. So we don't need to do all these steps. I can just put these, instead of these variables, just have those, statements. Whatever way is clearer to you guys. But now, date, birthday required. Actually, let's do a negative. And can't time travel. Now we have our date validations there. So validations, email regex, that's the last thing we needed to cover, right? So has anyone memorized the email regex? Because I sure haven't, right? So here's as much as I remember. Email regex, re.compile, r statement, right? So if you ever forget, like I do, there's a lower AZ, upper AZ, plus, period. Yeah.
A dot plus underscore.
Yeah, right? Well, you have like an eidetic memory, so that's awesome for you. For me,
We were talking about it earlier, that's why.
nice, yeah. My memory's garbage in case you guys haven't realized. So I usually just go back to somewhere where I know or some project I have that has it.
There's up top right there.
Yeah, it's the up top one. I usually just grab this whole phrase, right? So then we can just dump that right below. re.compile. Hey, I almost had it. And then lower AZ, upper AZ, 09, dot, plus, underscore, dash, plus that ampersand, or the at symbol, right? Then it needs that same sequence again as the first, plus a period, then just a sequence of just letters, basically. So what's up?
Import read.
Exactly, right? We have to import it. We have to make sure that we can use this thing that we're calling on. Kevin?
What's the plus dollar sign at the end of the regex?
Just that's the end of it.
Oh.
Yeah, it ends with at least one of a lower A to Z or an upper A to Z. It needs one or more of those, and that's the last thing.
So plus means like one or more?
Plus means one or more.
Oh.
Dollar sign is end. Yeah, so it needs one of these. Yeah. So we have our regex. We've imported it, right? And we've set up what our constant is, our email regex. And now we can just do one more check. If not, email regex.match, and essentially just the thing to check, request.posts at email. If our email doesn't match it, then messages.error, request, and get a better email. Something very supportive of our customers. Error equals true. So just one more check, right? So we've checked for password lengths, password matchings, date time valid, date time less than today, email regex, email valid. So, build a super robust one right now, and it's going to be easier to trim it down, But if we don't know how to do one of those things, then it'll become difficult. So some of these things we have seen before. So, they're all indicators for what might be on the exam, right? Everything in the platform might be there, plus a few things. So just be aware. So finally, after all this, let's make sure we can get stuff good. So we'll do everything valid except for the email. Get a better email. I think we're finished with validations now. Does anyone have questions about that entire process?
I was wondering, let's say someone minor tries to log in,
Yeah.
tries to register, how to make it date of birth. So pretty much the age should be more than 18.
Yeah. So I can say something like,
Is there a for loop for that?
we don't need a for loop. I can access my day, my birthday.year. I can access today.year. If I subtract those or subtract these date times from each other, I might end up with a value, right? So that's how you would do something like that. Are you over 18? Yeah. And no one lies on the internet, so you don't have to worry about anyone putting a bad birthday or anything like that. So I don't even put my real birthday in age checks. Like I just put January 1st, 1942. But anyway, so yeah, you would do something like that, right? See if you can subtract them, see what happens. It's all good, man. All right, so finally, down at this block where we said this is our safe area, this is our safe space down here. This is where we would create our thing, right? Whatever it is we wanted to make. And we're creating a user. How do I communicate with my models? What do I have to do? I have to import them, right? So from models, import all. And when I do that, I'm essentially pulling all my models in. You can do them piecemeal. I can say from models import record, comma, user. That'll work just fine too. I'm going to be using everything here, so I'm just going to import all of them. Multi-app applications is where you really want to start to be specific. I don't need all these models. I'm not going to use all these models. I just want user. Let's just pull user in. Do you have a question? Cool. All right, guys. So, guys and gal. All right, so here is my safe area. I've imported my models. I can say something like user.objects.create, first name equals the request.post at first name, and last name equals the request.post at last name. Just to reiterate real quick, where is this coming from? The column name, right? On the class. Where's this coming from? From the form, right? So I'm saying, create me a user whose column first name is going to be this, whose column last name is going to be this, right? So all my columns that I want to target. First name, last name, email, request.post at email, date of birth equals, not the request.post at date of birth, because we want it to be a date time, right? So we could do something like, how do we turn a date time into how do we turn a string into a date time? Strip time, right? So we can literally use the same exact thing. I can say something like the date of birth is simply the strip time, the Python date version of that string. Let's turn on my wrap. What else did we have there? We had that, first, last, email, password, the request.post at password, created, updated, that's taken care of, first, last, email, password, date of birth. That's it, right? Am I good? Is this perfect? We should absolutely be hashing the password. So Tim pointed out that, wait a minute, you just took the user's plaintext password and put that plaintext password right into our DB. We don't want to do that ever. We don't want to know what the user's password is. We can reduce our liability if we don't know what the user's password is. We can say we never had plaintext passwords. If our system ever gets compromised, there's less liability at that point. So ultimately, it's bad practice to put plaintext passwords in your database. People still do it. We should absolutely not do it. You don't want to be part of that group. So what software do we use to encrypt or hash our passwords? bcrypt. So I have to import bcrypt. And when I import bcrypt, there are really two main methods that I'm using with bcrypt. Now, if you guys watched my video yesterday talking about login and registration, I take a bit of time in the beginning to talk about the difference between something encrypted and something hashed. At the end of the day, encryption is a two-way process. I can encrypt something, and later I can decrypt something to get the value back. So encryption is something that we use for messages, something that we use for basically data that we want to transmit, but data that we ultimately care about the integrity of the data, right? At the end of the day, I want to be able to retrieve this. Hashing is actually a process, it's similar to encryption in that it basically encodes something, but it's encoding in one direction. We never reverse engineer our hashed string. But the beautiful thing about hashing is the sequence that took us from A to Z, right? That took us from the input to the output is a repeatable sequence. So later if I put another string in, hello world, it should produce the same exact result. Now we cause a bit of randomness intentionally, because if I use the password hello world and Shahan uses the password hello world, ultimately, yes, they were both the same string, but it happened at different points in time. I don't want those to still produce the same results. If it does, then it's a bit easier to reverse engineer the system. But if I add some randomness that I can keep track of, which is called salting, if I salt the password, then it just adds an extra layer of randomness altogether that, exactly, so it was a salt day, right? Yeah, so extra layer of randomness that just makes our system more secure. So bcrypt is pretty standard. There are other types of hashing. MD5 is an older type. SHA, I'm sure you guys have heard of SHA. There's no perfect encryption or hashing. If you read like kind of those doomsday articles, they talk about how machine learning is going to destroy all of our encryption. It's also going to make better encryption, so I don't really understand the argument. But at the end of the day, no system's perfect, but this is a decent system that we use, and it's a standard.
So can you put import read, comma bcrypt instead of putting it on two different lines?
For that one, you probably could, yeah. Yeah, it's going to find bcrypt as a pip package, yeah. You probably could. The time you really want to be careful is if you're saying from a location import this, yeah. For those, you probably could. But if you guys are ever curious of how bcrypt is actually working, I suggest doing a deep dive on it because it's pretty interesting. You're not actually getting a hashed version of the string you entered. As much as we use it in that manner, the way it's actually working is that bcrypt, and this is a bit of an aside, bcrypt essentially has an internal state, like the function that runs, has some internal value. Now, when bcrypt does its hashing or does this compression function based on some input, it's modifying that internal state, repeated over and over and over for how much data gets put in. So it gets it in certain chunk sizes, and it'll modify the internal state, but it's almost like if you're running an engine from start and say you did this route, right? You turned left, you turned right, later turned left and left and left, and then a right, and then you ended up as having, your odometer showing, 4.2 miles or 5.8 miles. The way bcrypt works is that another string entered should still modify the internal state to the same extent. So you've essentially, from 0 to end, you've still affected the internal state in the same exact way with the same data. So it's a little weird, but you guys can do some deep dive on bcrypt and its inner workings, because encryption and hashing is fascinating stuff, but it very quickly gets away from the realm of web development and into the realm of computer science, which is awesome. And if you guys enjoy that stuff, I highly suggest doing a deep dive. But you'll often find that with these libraries, with MD5 or bcrypt or something like that, the way we interact with it, it's almost abstracted away, right? We just really handle these two methods that do most of the work for us. But the biggest thing to take away about hashing is it's the same repeatable process. And so when I enter a password later, I can confirm that it produced the same exact output as a preceding, same string being entered. So with bcrypt, again, as I mentioned, you're going to be using two main methods, bcrypt.hashpw and a bcrypt.checkpw. When do you think we're going to use the hashpw? Hashing our password, right? Right before we store it to our database, literally right now. And checkpw? Log in, right? Anytime we're trying to confirm that this produces the same result. So we will use bcrypt.hashpw before we create our user, saying something like hashpw, some variable, is basically equal to the result of bcrypt.hashpw. And with this method, it will take our request.post, basically the data to be hashed, request.post at password, or confirm password. It doesn't matter at this point. We know they're the same. Now, in order for it to properly understand, in order for bcrypt to properly understand and essentially use this string in a manner that will apply, or it can use it like, a number essentially, it's going to turn it into a byte string. So that byte string can affect the internal state that exists in bcrypt. So we run a .encode, and that's essentially getting it to be a usable form. Now, there exists a little snafu if you're doing this in Django 2, where we encode in UTF-8, we encode into byte string, then later we decode back into UTF-8 before we store it in our database. The older bcrypt, this is the Python 2 implementation of bcrypt that everyone else, aside from Dwayne, is using, the Python 2 implementation automatically does that for you. You don't have to decode it back. The way Python 2 versus Python 3 handles strings is slightly different. So we don't have to worry about decoding. But Dwayne, in working with Python 3 and in Django 2, he has to literally run this .encode, encode it in the proper manner, and then decode later before he stores it in the DB. For us, it's actually a little bit easier, but be aware if you ever make the transition, Dwayne's going to be your go-to as far as that bug is concerned. But you'll find some docs online, but honestly, it was very slim. We actually didn't find much online, and we were able to kind of reverse engineer what was going on. I saw Eduardo talk to me about the issue that was happening, and then we referred to a current project we're on that's in Django 2 and Python 3. And the decode is something new. So that's what happens, though, with these new versions of software, is it can very quickly turn into these kind of very granular issues that you would never imagine exist. But that's why versions are so important, right? There's nothing wrong, though, with working in the next version. We're going to obviously update at some point. But a lot of those little things can cause systems to break overnight. You know, why did this suddenly not work, right? So just be aware. But the way we work with it in Python 2 is we just put basically the string to hash dot encode. That's all we have to worry about. Then we send one more argument, bcrypt, and does anyone know what this is? Gensalt, right? bcrypt.gensalt. So what the salt is going to do is it's going to add random variants to our string and then hash it. And the beauty is that bcrypt is smart enough that it actually stores the salt, or an indicator as to what the salt was, in the hashed string. So if you actually, again, when you do that deep dive, the first something like 12 characters are actually devoted to saying what the salt is, essentially.
I saw that in some of the documentation I was looking at where you put a value inside Gensalt. What does that do?
I think it's just your own randomness on top of that salt.
Okay.
But the beauty is that, well, the drawback is you also still have to store that somewhere too, because that's what you're then using to basically salt the salt. So you can go layers down. If we were to do this in Flask MySQL with MD5, or if you did MD5 inside of Django, we can use our own salt. Some people will do like datetime.now or datetime.today and get whatever today's date is down to the millisecond, and that is the salt that they use. But then you also have to store that in the DB alongside the user record, so that when part of the login process is adding that salt to the password and then hashing it. So yeah, I mean, you can just add extra randomness. But I mean, bcrypt standard salt is good enough, I'd say. But you know, if you're security minded and you always want to make sure that you're doing everything you can to make it more secure, throwing that extra argument in there will add that extra variance. Yeah. So, but for us, we can do bcrypt.hashpw, sending in the thing to be hashed, dot encode, making sure it's in the proper format, then generating our salt and essentially combining it with that string and then mixing it all up, hashing it all up. Now that's returned and stored in this hashpw variable. So now instead of saying that my password is the request.posted password, my password is the hashed pw. And we can print it too, just to see what it looks like. And at this point, return redirect, well, we'll fix that in a second, but what am I going to want to do now that a user's registered? Welcome page, right? And it really means that we want to store something in session in order to say that our user, in fact, is logged in. So I want to say request.session user ID is equal to something, but what right now? Now I've created the user, now I have to go fetch that user. That's kind of a pain in the butt, right? I don't want to go searching for this user based on their email again or something like that. So what I can do is I can say the user, or some variable, is equal to this create statement. It still gets created. The right side still evaluates. I'm sure you guys have picked up by now that when we set an equals or an assignment, the right side pretty much always gets evaluated first, right? Excuse me. So the right side gets evaluated, and this method actually returns the newly created record. So it gets stored in the user, and I can access the user.id, storing my user's ID in session, and essentially logging them in. And instead of return redirect to an index anymore, we would say something like return redirect to a success page. So, doesn't exist yet, of course, but I'm going to do that next so we can actually get a page up and see if the data is there.
I just have one quick question. So I know it's like, you know, request session user ID. Why do you put .id at the end of like the user?
The user is a dictionary that came back from this create method, and with a dictionary I can access values, but I can actually use dot now. I think I can use square bracket. I think it's going to require dot. When it's a ORM tracked object, it's going to be dot.
Oh,
I think
so
it's going to give me you can't subscript with the yeah, it's kind of it's not a standard dictionary. It's like an ORM tracked object, so it works a little differently, but you can do the dot.
So it has to do with like the ORM aspect.
Yeah, it has to do with how that's packaging up data. Like a query set is the data type coming back, but that's its own thing, right? Remember, in OOP, we could access dot anything. We didn't say square bracket ID. I said the dog.run or the dog.health, right? In that way, I can say the user.id. I'm pretty sure it won't like this with these square brackets here, but we'll throw the .id and we'll be good. So, but different than a dictionary, right? The dictionary is actually square bracket key. So the user is what came back from the create statement. I'm storing the user's ID in my session, and I'm going to redirect to success. So let's make that real quick. Let's just be efficient. And success, back to our views, def success, and taking in the request. Let's return render some success page, which does not exist yet, right? I forgot what our app was called for a second. But not success.html. Let's actually make this main. And let's say redirect to main, and the URLs will make it main. So this is going to be our main section of our website, right? We're in, and it's going to render the main page that we created, main.html. Now, just to make sure that I have this user's data, I'm going to go ahead and make sure that I send up some context dictionary with that user's data. Now, the thing stored in session is just the ID, and if I just wanted to show the ID on the page, well, I don't even need to send it up with context, right? It's in session. However, I want to get the user's information more than likely somewhere in the website, but I don't want to store that entire user object in session. We still want to keep the ID there, but anytime I need the user to appear on the page, essentially, I just created a context dictionary, right? User, or however, user, and the user's value is going to be user.objects.get. What's going to be my where clause? ID equals the request.session at the user ID. You know, and don't be scared that I put it down here in the render. It's still just a dictionary, right? I'm still just creating some type of context dictionary. I just decided to put it inside of my render function rather than put it in a variable. It's the only thing. If it's like a one-liner, I usually do this, you know? So render that main.html, send up the whole user object because I got the user object based on the person whose ID was in session. Cool? What's up?
So, but then when we go to the main, do we have to validate the user's session? We have to do that validation?
So that's the thing. Main, this function would have to do that, right?
Yeah.
So what Tim's talking about is some sort of check. Just like we check to see if the request.method was not a post, we should check to see if the user is in session. So how do I check for a key in a dictionary?
User ID.
Yeah, or I can say if not user ID in request.session. I'm a very negative person, so I like to do the opposite. So if they're not there, kick them out. Whichever way works for you. It's nice for me to not use else statements. I don't know. But you can say if the user ID is in session, that whole block of code inside of that statement. I just say if they're not there, kick them out.
Yeah, it's like an early exit.
Exactly, in a sense. Yeah, so if the user ID is not in session, return, redirect, back to index, and I can even tell them, hey, let's create a message for them. Messages.error. Yeah, exactly. Nice try. Scram. So we're telling this user to scram because they're not logged in. We kicked them back to index. Otherwise, we return render. And you know what? Just because I'm thinking about what we're going to do next, I'm actually going to take this out and set this as a context dictionary and just name it and set it out there because we'll work with it in a little bit. We'll probably put some more stuff there. I have a feeling we'll need some more data. And just send the context. No difference, right? But I know that we'll put some more stuff. So in our main, we're checking is the user in session. If they're not, kick them out. Otherwise, we're building a context dictionary that contains the user object and sending that context dictionary forward to be rendered on the page. So let's just say, all right, and user, right? So let's try to get in there without going through login. Nice try. Scram. Or register, I should say. There's no ID in session. We haven't logged in or registered this user. So now let's create a user. Patrick, the guy, pat@gmail.com, birthday before today, password. What? Dang it. And beautiful user object, right? Let's see that hash string too. We saw the password, so check it out. So that's what our 10p's turned into. It'll always be some length. It's always technically 160 bits or 512 bits. Forgetting on the actual length, but it's always a certain allocated size. So it'll even pad, lower values. 128, yeah, for this one. So it'll even, like if you put something in that's not 128 bits, it'll just pad it with zeros, and then it's weird. The last sequence is then telling you how long it was. It's, yeah. But again, a repeatable process, right? So right now, let's see, time zone support, we don't have to worry about that. But ultimately, we have our user. Our user essentially logged in now through this registration process. We've created our user, right? So it looks like registration is pretty much finished, right? Any questions about everything we've done so far? Still have quite a bit to get through, right? Are you guys okay to go for a little longer? Cool. All right. Awesome. Once we get through login reg, that's kind of the beast, right? And once we get through that, then it's just making stuff. So take some time to get your login registration finished, because ultimately we can probably reuse a lot of our code, right? I mean, make it bulletproof. You don't want to be sitting there hacking through validations and wondering, well, having said that, don't just copy paste and think it's going to work. You know, you have to do both, right? Make it ahead of time so you know exactly what's going on. But when you do decide you want to take some code and put it elsewhere, still validate it line by line. The biggest time waste is assuming it's going to work. In general, right? Assuming something's going to work sucks, because 9 times out of 10 it won't. But justifying line by line, is it still called this? Is this the right name? You know, that sort of thing, that's going to help you in the end. So as much as it might be done ahead of time, still validate that it's all good when you're doing it. So I can say user.firstname, and I can say, let's wrap this in a little H3 and get this over here, and we'll say hello, user.firstname, and hello Patrick, right? Now notice I didn't render, I just redirected, right, to the main that's going to be in charge of some other things, more than likely. So we are in. Let's just finish the login process real quick, and we'll do a log out. Actually, we'll do log out first so we can get our user logged out of the system. Def log out, honestly pretty easy comparatively. Request.session.clear. Only do a clear if you're not worried about any other data in your session, because it wipes everything. Typically it's okay, but if you're doing certain things, maybe you don't want to wipe the entire dictionary. But for our purposes right now, it'll work. Return, redirect back to the index. And
I'm sorry, what's the alternative?
the alternative is just to do a del. We can del a specific key, just like we could with a dictionary. But the nature of del is if it's not there, you'll get in trouble. So let's create a logout URL and log out. Going to views.logout, which we just made. Throw that $sign on there. All right, so we have a logout now, and we can see, actually we can see the behavior. I'm at main still. I can refresh to my heart's content. I log out. Now if I go back to /main, it's not going to let me because I've deleted it from session. Make sure you do that check, because if your logic is based on the user ID existing, it's not only for protection at that point, it's also making sure your logic's not going to break, because I will do exactly that. I will log out and then try to access that page again, and when it breaks, I will remove points. So I'm telling you straight up, make sure you get that to work properly, right? That check to see if the ID is in session, making sure that if it's not in session, we do redirect a user. So log out in the bag. Let's build our login. Def login, taking in the request. And when we take in our request, we don't really care about validations here as much. We more so care about if this email exists, and if this email does exist, if the password is the same, right? That's it. We don't care that they entered 8 digits or 7 digits. The password just won't be the same. I don't want to tell them, hey, your password's 12 characters, you actually entered 6, so try it again. Right? We don't want to tell the user any more information at this point in time. It just opens us up to exploits. So you'll notice that the messages I'll use are still going to say things like invalid email or password. I don't want to tell the user, hey, your email's right, but the password's wrong. Or hey, your password's right, your email's wrong. Well, that's impossible. But your email's right, your password's wrong. Then suddenly people can social engineer things. They can say, oh, you have an account here, here, and here. Now I know which phishing email to send you. Things like that. So be aware of how much information you're giving your users back, or potential, black hat, whatever. So when we get the information from the user, there are 2 main ways to get the user based on their email and then check the password. The first is it's a lot going on, so I'll kind of explain what we're going to do. So I'm going to say something like the user equals, and how do I get a single object back from my database? How do I get a single user back? User.objects. I was hoping more people would say because that's scary. User.objects.get, where ID. Does the user know the ID that they're logging in with? We know their email, right? Login, we know their email. Where email is what? Request.post at email. Now, does anyone know what happens if I try to get something that's not there?
Error.
Error. Doesn't return anything. It errors. So, knowing it's going to error, what does this return if it can't find anything? An empty list. An empty list. No dictionary. Empty list. It would be a list of dictionaries if it was populated, but if it doesn't have anything, unlike the get, which breaks, if the filter doesn't have anything, it just returns an empty list. So as far as user-submitted information, like based on, if we're looking in the database, the filter is a little bit more safe from the outset, right? It's not going to break even if nothing comes back. But if something does come back, can I just access the user.firstname? Why not? Well, what's the user data type? A list. The list doesn't have a .name, right, or .firstname. The list has indices, the indices which might relate to dictionaries, the dictionaries which might have a first name. But in order to get the user into a usable state, we would say something like the user is equal to the user at the 0 index. You can do this. This works. This will work just fine. The last thing that we'd want to do if we were doing this scenario is check the length of the user, right?
Could you do the user equals user.objects.filter this dot first?
Yeah, you should be able to do that.
What would return if there wasn't a dot first? None?
A dot first on an empty query set. I don't know. We'll try it.
Does not exist or error.
Yeah, it might be an error at that point, because if it's an empty query set, I don't know the behavior of that one. But what you could do is you could essentially do the same thing and say the 0. But my thinking is it's going to try to do that with the dot first, so then it would give me an index out of bounds because it doesn't have a 0. So the typical way is to do just a length check, right? If the length is greater than 0, hey, we got something. If it wasn't greater than 0, what does that mean? Exactly, right? This user's an idiot and they don't know their email address, right? So very supportive here. So we know that if it didn't come back, they didn't have a matching email. Now that's one of the two ways. And I talk about this more specifically in the video as well. The alternative option, if you're aware of the behavior of get, and this is something more standard too, if you're aware of something erroring out, which is fine, what you do is you'd say the user is equal to the user.objects.get. Do the risky behavior. But we want to put the risky behavior in a try block. Now a try block is a try and accept block, basically. So I can try some code, and if it's going to break, I can do some alternative code. So it's almost just like a super roided out if statement. Like it will understand when an error occurs, and it will say, hey, if there was an error, do this instead. The user will not see an error. Why this is tricky is because sometimes if you're not anticipating the error, it can make your program flow very weird, and you don't know why you ended up with the result that you did because you didn't see any error along the way. It just redirected flow. So do this only when you're confident that you know the specific bug that might happen. Cool? This is my preferred way. It's not necessary. You can get the list, do the length check, get the user at the 0 index. Ultimately, we still end up with a user dictionary or user object. This way, we try to get the user, and if we can't, we just basically have the end of that whole result. We don't have a user, right? So whichever way you like better, this can be more concise, but it's also a little bit more confusing, possibly. So I will try to get the user and put it in this user variable. The scope will be the function, so I'll still actually get that variable if it works. Otherwise, messages.error, sending a request, saying email or password invalid. I don't want to tell the user that they had a bad email. I'm just going to tell them, hey, you're done. So return, redirect, back to the index route. So I'm going to go with this solution here. I go more in depth onto the other solution in the video. All of that is fair game during the exam, whichever decision you make. The other thing that we want to do is there's another bug that exists with the Git. Does anyone know what the other bug is? If more than one record tries to get returned. If there's 2 matching emails in my system, it's also going to error out. So the last thing I'd want to do up here as part of my validations is essentially try to get this user, right? If I try to get the user and the user does exist, then I can say, hey, wait a second. You already used that email address. I can do a try and accept, or what I honestly like to do up here is saying something like if the len of, this might look a little weird, user.objects.filter, where the email equals the request.post at email. So give me the query set of all the users whose email matched what the user just tried to register with. If that comes back and it's greater than 0, what does it mean? Yeah, someone else used that email. You're out of luck. So if the len of that comes back and it's greater than 0, then I can say messages.error, and I can say email already taken or get a better email. Email already taken. I would like to say email invalid. This one, it's kind of up to you. Email already taken is okay as well. And error equals true. So what this check does, this is back in the registration, but I didn't want to do it kind of just in a vacuum without looking at what was happening. But it's ultimately trying to say, does that email already exist in our records? And if it does so, tell the user the email's taken and error them out. Now, because of that, we can be certain that when I run a Git, I won't get duplicates. I'll just get the one. And I'll be able to use the try and accept to just have that one or nothing at all. Cool? So once I have it, down here I actually have access to the user. So we talked about bcrypt.checkBW, bcrypt.checkBW. Basically the request.post, the first one is the password to check, the password. And what do I have to run on it? .encode. You have to do it here as well, .encode. The second argument is the password we're checking against, which is the user, because we have that variable at this point in our code, the user, .password, .encode. So this statement will return a Boolean, true or false, if they're the same or if they're not the same. So if not, I can do that, or I can say if it's good. If it's good, if it's true, then we know that this user is now, should be logged in, right? We had a matching email. With that matching email, we found a matching password. We used our logic to determine that it was matching. Then we say something like request.session at the same thing, user ID, is equal to, and we already have the user object, so there's no point in doing, getting it again, the user, .id. The request.session is equal to the user ID, return, redirect to where? Main, right? Else, and we didn't even need an else, return, redirect, back to index. And one final, if the request.method does not equal post. Return, redirect, and we'll put that nice message we had for the user from before. Oh, we didn't tell a message. So now when I try to just go to /login, oh, I didn't define a URL. We just created this whole function without defining a URL, right? So let's do that. Let's go to register and URL r and login. Logan. All right. That was such a good movie. I love that movie. All right. Anyways. Cool. So now we'll see that it'll get us kicked back out. What's that? Logan? Yeah. That movie was crazy. They did like a black and white re-release afterward, which is pretty cool. All right, so if I try to navigate to login, it's a GET request, of course. It's going to kick me back out. If I try to do that, email or password invalid. Empty string email got submitted. No email matched that. If I try to go pat@gmail.com, well, we didn't create an error message for them. Email matched, but it wasn't a valid password. So let's fix that right now and get a message there. If bcrypt, so we'd want to do it down here, right? Messages.error, sending request, and basically the same phrase. Not even basically, the same phrase is what I'm going to tell the user. I don't want to give them any more data. So pat@gmail.com, but it helped us see the different behavior. We knew we were at a different place in code because we didn't get that message. So finally, pat@gmail.com, and we're logged in. So again, it's a lot. Login reg is a lot. Take some time, today or tomorrow, to get it finished. If nothing else, get that finished so you guys can have a good start. Login reg is not good enough to pass the exam, but without login reg, you will not pass the exam. You know, we need at least that. So,
What
we have.
what was the method if not method dot?
If request.method does not equal a post method. Because it breaks down, if I don't have this, as soon as I try to access the form data, let's take it out for a second and see the behavior. And this goes for any post, anything you're processing, accessing request.post. If I go to login, oh, you know what? I wonder if it's hitting the try block, and see, this is where it gets weird. The error had nothing to do with the get statement. The error had everything to do with accessing request.post at email, which didn't exist. But because it's a try and accept block, that's completely invisible to me. I just see it not working and just going away. So only use the try and accept, again, when you're very certain you've got one bug to work with, because otherwise your code just not going to make any sense. But yeah, technically, if we have this not in a try and accept, then it would error out at that point. It would tell me multi-value dict key error. You have no request.post at email.
We used the try and accept for our validation yesterday,
Mhm.
but in the accept we had to define the user dot does not exist. Do you,
Oh, except that type of error?
yeah.
Yeah.
To specify.
You can expect specific errors, so that way you can filter based on the type of error it is. Yeah.
Otherwise, it's just a catch-all.
The default is just a catch-all, which can work, but as you just saw, it doesn't always do exactly what we need it to do. So, but you can be more explicit, and in that way you can have different things happen.
And you have multiple accepts.
Yep. Yeah. Cool. Okay, so we have our working registration login. Any questions about that? We kind of want to get in and start making stuff, right? So let's start making things. Let's make a form so that I can make stuff. On our main.html, we're pretty much done with the index at this point, and I'll move main to the end of my tabs because this is where I'm working. So hello, this first name, and we'll say something like h3, add a record to our system, and I'll have a form going to /add, and what do we need to make sure our form has? Our cserv, and let's say input type text name artist, and we don't need an ID, and input type text name album, and input type text named label, right? Label, and input type submit. Ah, thank you. Yeah. So what would that have done? It would have done a get, right? So I would have seen everything up in my URL, which we don't want. I mean, for this one, it would actually be okay, but the way we have to access get data is differently. So we just typically say form request.post. But you can do that if you want to. That's perfectly fine. Will require on the exam, it's a post. We want to get you used to using these posts. So thank you. Method post going to a /add has artist, album, and label. Artist and album and label, and let's log in. Actually, I should be logged in, I think. /main. Let's see. Yeah, we're logged in already. All right, so we can add an artist with an album and a label, and just below that form, I'm gonna have what will be all records. And this will be all records from the DB. We can have all records from the DB, and we can allow our user to edit only their records. That's reasonable, right? You'd want that. Then we'll say below that, so this is some div. Below that, we'll say we have something like, hated records or something like that, right? Because we're very negative. So we hate certain records. So we'll have a table of all of our records. We'll have a table of our hated records. So let's just kind of nail the functionality real quick. In the list of all records, I want to have options for edit and delete on my records. I want to have options to hate any record, regardless if it's mine or someone else's. When I hate a record, I'm going to want to see it on a different section, right? I'm going to want to see it in a different thing altogether, or appear there. And I can unhate a record too. Let's say that. Cool? All right, so we just want to nail that. Let's first deal with adding things, because nothing else is really going to matter until we can add something. So with this form, going to /add, I'll start my process here. URL r going to add. And I'm gonna harp on it. It's all about workflow. Everything in our system works right now, not because it was magic, but because we tested it at every single pass, right? We printed every piece of data that we cared about. We tested every single validation when we wanted to. Before we created our user, we made sure our user was being created properly when it was. We made sure we hashed everything. We made sure we logged in properly. Don't just start designing things like 40% and 60% and 80% because you can't even test to see if the rest of it works, right? If you hit bug after bug after bug after bug, it becomes hard to figure out what you were even working on by the end of your hour-long bug session. But if you're building up brick by brick by brick and testing, the stability of this entire system the entire time, you'll have less bugs. And if you do hit bugs, they're going to be smaller. They're not going to dump right into another bug. So views.add, we of course need to create that function. Def add, taking in the request, and we can say if the request.method does not equal post. If it doesn't equal post, we will return redirect back to main. And we can even say further, if the request.session, or specifically if not, the user ID in request.session will kick this user back to the index anyways, right? They shouldn't even be here at all. Return redirect back to the index route. So if the ID isn't in session, kick them out. If it wasn't a post, put them back at the main page, right? If they try to do a GET request. Now finally, we're at an OK block where we know that it was a post and they're logged in. Then we can say something like maybe validate the length of the album or artist or label. We might want to do that. But ultimately, we would just want to create this record, right? So this is where I'll put just a note. I'm not going to sit here and do more validations because at the end of the day, are they going to be any different than how we implemented the other validations? They might be custom, but they're not going to be any different. So validations, right? Then when we're good, record.objects.create. What columns do I have with record? Let's double check that. So columns for record, artist, album, label, uploader, and haters. All right, so let's start with artist. What's the value of artist? Request.post at the artist, right? And the same exact thing for album. Oh my goodness. Album, Dumbledore. Album, the request.post at the album. And what else do we have? The label. The request.post at the label. Uploader, well, what do I put for the uploader? Here's where you have two options. If I wanted to use the ID in session, I can. I could say the request.session at user underscore ID, but it would no longer be uploader equal to. It would be uploader underscore ID equal to. Even though the column name is called uploader, it's expecting, just as uploader, it's expecting an uploader or a user object. If I wanted to use the ID and not worry about getting the object, I can say uploader underscore ID and just provide a number. Honestly, the way, if you want to remember less rules, just say uploader is equal to a real user object. Not a user's name, not a user's ID, the user object. How do I retrieve the user's object? User.objects.get, where ID equals the request.session at user ID. That's it. It's up to you. I like this way. I like putting the whole object there. It's less to worry about. It's less about stripping the ID off and put the ID here and there. I don't care about that. Just get the record. Get the user. Whatever it needs to be, just get it. Right? But you need the whole thing. So we have an album. It's the request.posted album. The label is the label. The uploader does not come from the form at all. Does not come from post date at all. It's a real user object based on the user's ID in session. It's up to you though. But I like this way.
It's okay to store that entire.
it doesn't store the entire thing. It still strips off the ID and still puts just the ID there in the foreign key. So that's the thing about it. It's not like we're dumping extra data there. It's the ORM is smart enough to make the relation regardless. It's just two options for how you want to put it there, but ultimately it's the same representation of another entity.
So it refers back to the foreign key
Yep.
model and knows
Yeah.
to do that.
Yeah, it's going to do the same exact thing for us, but you just have options. I like this way. Now here's the thing about foreign keys. If I have a foreign key standard with no null equals true nonsense, it will require that I have this real entity here, or the ID, when I make this object. I have to have it. I have to put something for that column. Many-to-manys, there's no possible way to know the whole set of things that might happen in the future. Many-to-manys, even if I wanted to put it here, I can't. So we have a haters, which is a many-to-many. I don't need to worry about that at all. When I'm uploading a record anyways, how could it possibly have people that liked or disliked it at the point of upload? It doesn't make sense, but it for sure will have an uploader. So keep that in mind. Foreign keys are required unless you say null equals true, but usually it's okay to just make it required because we wouldn't have a record in our system without an uploader. That's just a rule we can define. Typically it works that way, so it's up to you, but typically it's required anyway, so it doesn't matter. Many-to-manys, however, we affect after the creation of this through a different process, and we'll talk about that when we get to that point of creating the actual thing. But record.objects.create all this data, including the uploader, and then I have my record essentially created. Do I need to put it in a variable? I mean, it depends on what we're doing with it, but I'm going to say the flow is when you add a record, it's just bringing you back to the main page, right? There's nothing happening. And just like we did a couple times now, we're just going to create it and then just redirects. Return redirect back to, not index, but main, right? Back to the main page. Now, main is not only going to be responsible for getting the user, but what also will we want from main? Or on the main page, what do we want there? A list of all the records, right? So along with user, records. Record.objects.all. Just give me every record. Context is still being sent up. Main.html, all records. Let's create a little Jinja for record in all. Oops. Don't forget your names, like I do. And then it capitalized it for fun. Records. For record in records. And N4. And we can even make a little table here, make this look nice. This is up a table, yeah, TH. What do you have? The artist album label. Artist album label. And then we'll have like an actions, like you can delete or edit, right, whatever action we might do. Not a TH, not a TD, but a TH, right? And actions. Now we'll say for record in records, and just think about the element you're wanting to repeat. We want to repeat a row that has these corresponding data, elements here, right? So we're gonna generate for each record, we're generating a row that has a bunch of TDs, right? TD, 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 and we'll have record dot title artist. Right, we want to correspond with the order of these THs, so it looks good. Record.artist, then we want to do record.title or album, and record.label. And lastly, our actions. So we'll talk about those in a second, but it would ideally be edit, delete, hate. All right, so artist, album, label, actions. We haven't added any records to our system, so we don't expect anything to be seen. But what's a record? Wow.
Yeah.
Thank you. All right, so The Wall by Pink. The Wall by Pink Floyd. I don't know. All right. Pink Floyd, The Wall. I don't know. Delete. Obviously, this looks like garbage. So let's make this look a little nice. Let's see if this will affect it differently.
Shouldn't the table, this table tag be after the import?
Did I put it inside?
It's a
Aha! That's also why it looked very ugly. And that's more so why it looks very ugly, actually. That's why nothing was formatted on the inside. There we go. So at least it kind of makes sense now, right? Obviously, you guys can come in here and spend all the time in the world styling this out. This isn't a style lecture, so, you know, have fun with that. But on the exam, I'm not going to sit there and, oh, this wasn't green. You know, there's no style score. If it looks like garbage, though, like if I can't even figure out what's going on, that's a problem. Like, and this comes from someone who hates styling, so don't worry, you know, but like if it's just jumbled, that's not going to make any sense. At least put it in a table. You know, do me that favor. At least have it make sense, but I don't care about styling. So you guys do that on your free time. But right now we have a way to add, let's say, artist, another one, let's say ZZ Top, and what's an album? I Have a Beard. That's not an album by them, but I know. Beards is the record label. Birds. All right, so we have another record, right? We'll create out of the way. Let's go for edit. Delete is usually pretty easy. Reading, we've already got reading done. So really now it's just a matter of editing and deleting this thing, right? Now, guys, this has gone a little long. Are you okay for a little bit longer? All right, cool. You guys can filter out, too. Don't feel obligated. I just want to get through a ton of this, just to kind of do a full, you know, thing. This will set you up well for the belt reviewer tomorrow, and then we can take some time to really nail that thing. So, edit, delete, hate. We'll worry about that in a second. Edit is going to be the biggest thing we want to worry about. But edit, we typically have an edit page, right? So we already have this edit.html. I'm going to actually start here with this process because I like to consider, you know, what data this will need. So, edit. More often than not, an edit is really just a form, right? Edit this record. Let's say edit record, and then we'll say number, and I'll leave this as a little space for the ID. I will put the ID there, right? So record.id. Form, and the typical way we create an edit is that we have, you know, a form going somewhere, and the form is going to be a post method. And of course, serve. Now, what did we have? We had artist, album, label. That's it, right? So we have an input, and honestly, we can actually repurpose the same form. It doesn't need to change at all, other than where it's going. So grab that, go back to our edit. Let's dump all that there. Artist, label, album, input, edit, or submit, or whatever the heck we want to call it. Now here's where it gets different. Does anyone know what else I do to this form to make it work properly for my edit? Pre-fill the values. This does two things for me. It makes a better user experience in general because the user can see what they're typing versus what should be there. But it also allows me to not have to worry about, did the user actually change this thing or not, right? If the name was Pink Floyd, or if the artist was Pink Floyd and they didn't affect it, I mean, essentially our logic still updates everything. It still sets Pink Floyd to Pink Floyd again. But I don't have to worry about distinguishing, did they change it or did they leave it the same? If I didn't do that and I just updated everything across the board, suddenly I'd have dumped every single value, right? Because I would have said, hey, it was all these empty things. The user decided they didn't want to do it, so they just click submit, because they'll do that. So just be aware, they'll do stuff that doesn't make sense. We have to make it make sense, right? So by them, you know, doing the laziest option, which is clicking that button, it still wouldn't affect their data. I mean, it absolutely would, right? It overwrites every value, but to be the same value. So value, and we don't normally put the value, right? We usually read from the value, but now we're going to be placing it. Value equals something like record dot artist. And of course, there's no data being sent here. We haven't set up any router function, but we can know ahead of time that I'm going to be putting some record dot something here, right? That's going to be the value pre-filled. You can put a piece of text there just to test it out, just to see what it looks like, how it places it there. But ultimately, this is what we're going to want to go towards. We're going to say it's the record's artist, album, and the record dot label. So when it gets submitted, it's going to go to an edit. But here's where it gets a little more tricky. When I go to my edit function, how do I use my edit function in a way that's going to understand which record it should edit? Pass in the ID. So there's two ways to do it. We've talked about this before. I can pass it via a hidden input. I can also pass it via a URL parameter. I'm going to choose the URL parameter. It's a little bit more standard, I'd say. So edit slash, or even I could do I could do record number slash edit, but I'll do edit slash record number. And when I say record number, we're talking about the ID. So again, it's not there yet, but I'll have to create a couple URLs right now. I'll have to create the URL and function that render this page, and I'm going to do that first. But then afterward, I'm going to create the URL and function that take in this form's data and render. So let's get started with the URL and function that render this page. URL, it's going to go to R and an uptick, and it'll be an edit. And it's going to take in a $sign. Let's go to views.edit, and in our views.edit, blah, 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 def edit, taking in the request. Well, wait a second. I need a record, right? We called it record up there. I need a record. But how do I know which record to get here? I have to pass this one through, right? So I need to change my URL a little bit because edit slash number should probably be this one, right? Edit slash, and we'll say the record number. So we'll create our capture group, question mark P, and we'll say ID, and we could even say rec underscore ID, whatever you want to call it, slash D plus, ending that group. So edit slash some variable number is going to go to our views.edit. Views.edit now needs to take in that slash variable number, the rec ID, the same variable name, and now we can grab that record. Record.objects.get. Gets are safe when I'm using IDs, typically, because the ID came from within my system, right? There should be no question of whether it's good data or bad data. A get is pretty much safe at this point. Filter we use for that user-submitted data, right? The stuff that we want to grab things based off of. That's why we use the filter or that special technique for doing the try and accept. But with an ID, it's pretty safe to assume I should have that ID. Record.objects.get, where the ID is equal to, not the request.session, but the record ID, right? The one I passed up there. Return, render, sending it the request, getting header slash edit HTML, sending up context. So at this point, I've got the URL, I've got the page set up. Let's see if we can get it to show properly. Obviously, I haven't set up the links yet, but I should be able to go to edit slash to and see that all get populated. So I can see ZZ top, I can see I have a beard, label is birds, so we'll want to fix that. It'll be the first thing we edit. If we look at our elements, we'll actually see that the form is already going to go to edit slash to, which we actually have to kind of distinguish right now, because we're not going to submit to the same place that rendered this page, but we can see all of our data, right? The values were set, we should get new values from this, and finally the edit. So let's distinguish real quick. Let's go back to our edit. A couple things. Record ID there. Record ID. Let's make this the real Jinja tag now to get that real record ID. And instead of edit slash record slash, we can do some like slash confirm, right? So that final thing, confirm. And in our URLs, of course, we'll set that up. Any questions on how we essentially pass the data from somewhere else to here, right? We're really not passing anything. And I think that the URL might have just highlighted exactly why it's not being passed from one page to the other. I didn't click a link that somehow transmitted the data to this page. I simply went to slash edit slash some valid ID. I go to 12, well, it's not going to like that, right? It's not going to, it doesn't exist. But if I go to edit slash to, all that first function was in charge of was saying, hey, get the record, put it in a context dictionary, render this page with that record there. Now, ultimately, we'll want to have that edit button exist on the records, right? So let's do that super quick. Main.html. And instead of edit, we're still going to have it say edit, but I'm going to create an ahref, right? A tag, href slash edit slash, exactly, the record.id. And we're going to say it's called edit. So now if I click this button, hey, suddenly I'm looking at the wall. If I click this button, hey, I'm looking at ZZ top. All right, so I'm editing these things. Questions? Cool, we'll just keep going then. All right, so I'm here now, editing ZZ top. When I edit, when I click this, it's going to say, hey, you don't have an edit slash number slash confirm. So let's create that, right? Start with our URL again, and we'll do that, edit slash number /confirm here. Go to views dot it won't be a destroy, but modify or something to differentiate from edit. Views def modify, taking in the request, and it also takes in that recorded or record ID, right? And in this, what do we do? How do I edit something? I never lectured this, but I know it's in the platform. What's that?
You set a variable to the object that you want to change.
Okay, so let's say something like record equals, and you're saying we need to get that record?
And get it from the get the record ID.
Okay, so I've got it now.
And then you get the column name you want to change and put in a dot. Record dot. Album, artist, whatever. And then you set it to some other string or whatever.
Some value, right? Well, the value in this one is coming from the post. Let's make sure we do our check. But that's perfect, right? We get the record, and then we just access dot this is equal to something else, dot this is equal to something else, right? Just like an object when we did OOP. So if not user underscore ID in the request.session, oh my goodness. Return redirect main index. If they don't exist. Otherwise, get that record, target that record's artist, for instance, and say it's the request.post at artist.
Since we're continuing to use that code block, can we just separate it as a separate function and call it each route?
Yeah, validator. You can do that. Yeah. And there's a technique that you'll see in Django and in Python and other places called a decorator function. And you essentially, like when we did app route way back when with Flask, that was a decorator function. So you could do that you could put it in a side function and just call it. That'll work too. So yeah, whatever works for you. If not, or let's see, if the request.method does not equal post, same thing. So you probably check for those too, right? Return redirect back to main. And actually, I don't really need to do this check anyways, because if I'm redirecting to main and their ID is not in session, it's going to kick them back to index anyway. So logically, we don't even need that one. So if the request.method is not a post, kick them back to main, which would subsequently kick them back if they didn't exist in session. But ultimately, that's a good question. Ultimately, to affect this entity, simply that entity variable, record.album, is equal to the request.post at the album. And this is what I meant when I was saying we just modify everything in a sense regardless, right? But if the user did change something, it just gets overwritten in that way. Otherwise, it just gets overwritten with the same data. Jeff?
Would it be bad to set like an if statement if the string is empty and request not post? If that's empty, don't affect it? Or is there really...
But what if they wanted it to be empty?
Okay.
There's no good way to figure out what the user wanted. That's the tough part. We can't predict what they want.
Right.
We can just build our system in a way where we hope they're not stupid. Yeah, again, that's asking a lot. But ultimately, I affect these three categories. I'm not going to change the uploader of this record because that's not going to change. But what do I now have to do? Save. I have to save when I run an update like this. Record.dave. Record.save. And let's return redirect right back to the main. A lot, right? But I think we have almost full CRUD on this one entity, and then actually the last bits aren't too bad for what we're doing. So the wall IDK, the wall Stevens songs. Yeah, Steven, you have a record label now, man. Cool. Is he even in here? There he is. Steven songs, right? Birds, supposed to be beards, and then ZZ top, XY top. I don't know, whatever. That doesn't matter, right? We're just putting silly stuff, but we can edit, right? Delete. That one's not too bad. Let's go back to main. Let's start it here. Let's start our URL, right? href/delete/ and we're going to give it the delete ID. Or not the delete ID, but the record ID. And we're not even going to have a confirmation page. I'm just going to say, if you click this delete button, that's it. You deleted it. Good job, dork. Right? Whatever we want to say to the user. Delete. doesn't exist yet, right? So let's make that URLs. And we'll just cheat a little bit. We'll get that guy. We'll repurpose it because it's already got that nice little thing. The URL parameter, record ID, same exact thing. Views.delete. I broke the cardinal rule. I'm not calling it destroy, right? Unfortunately, but whatever. We've gone too far. All right, request rec ID and record.objects.get a record based on its ID being what was passed in the parameter. .delete.
What's gonna stop someone from inputting that URL
Oh yeah,
and deleting all
and
of
just
your
making a GET request there. We could ask for their ID in session before we do this. We could do that because otherwise, no matter where I am on the website, if I don't protect this one, I could just do that. Yeah, any request from any point. So if not user ID in request.session, and this should work for both internal and external because at the end of the day, if it's an external request that's being made, their ID still doesn't exist in session. There's no ID in session for that specific client. So return a redirect back to the index. Just to highlight what Tim was saying is, since this is just a simple function, like a GET function, that's just taking in a random ID, if at any point any user, any person had just said delete /7, they just would have effectively deleted record 7. But if instead, inside the function, I'm saying, hey, require that their ID is in session, then allow them to delete if it is in session. If it's not, no matter where it's coming from, it can't happen.
Would that be something like only admin?
Well, that's another check what we can do too. So we wanted, part of the permissions was to say only the user that's stored in session, only the user that's stored in session would be able to delete a record. We can do another check right here. If the user ID does not equal record.uploader_ID, don't let them do this. So just another way. The last thing, so I mean this should be the delete. We are running low on time and we have to start setting up here for the open house. So the last thing, because now we have full CRUD on this one entity, right? We have full CRUD on these records, but we want to make sure we can actually use the foreign key, and we want to make sure that we can use this many to many, right? Because it's all about relations at the end of the day. So let's get through this one real quick. Return redirect back to the main. Make sure that's working real quick, and delete, and hey, deleted, believe it or not. All right, and AAA, BBB, I almost wrote LSD. Okay, so we have these things here. We can affect these things. We want to start to target this, but two things. Let's say that instead of just having an all records, we have a my records. And a way you could do this is, there's two ways. We could just run through the existing all records with a,
If statement?
yeah, I can do an if statement, right? But rather than have it run through all the things arbitrarily if I don't need it, I'm actually just going to put it in my views as another part of context. And it's honestly up to you. I'm not going to mark anyone down on that either way. But instead of having records, let's say my records. And it's going to be record.objects.filter, where
Uploader is equal to request.session user ID.
again, the user object or uploader_ID is equal to that. So one of the two, but we can't mix them like that. User.objects.get, and that ID equaling the request.session. I know, I don't know why I prefer this method, I just do. I mean, don't let that color your decision. Ultimately, if you did it Tim's way, but actually both Tims have asked that question. If you did it the Tim's way, we would say uploader_ID equals request.session at user ID. Notice, the column is not uploader_ID. That's why it gets a little weird, right? But we're just saying the uploader is literally equal to this entity, this record. Upload just the object. And that's the thing is, I feel like even though the object is another query, it still helps me relate these entities in my mind. So I don't mind it, but you know, whatever works for you guys. I've never told you once, like, this is the way you absolutely have to do it. There's always options, so just be aware. But just understand the implications, right? So, record.objects.filter. Now I've got my records. Now we're going to say something like for record in my records. And we will end our for. And we'll say something like Hey, let's just actually copy that whole thing. That's gonna be nice. And end our table. What? Okay. So for record of my records, I actually don't want that there at all. Don't want this at all, but we'll just make this my records. So we have two things, right? We have my records printing out for every record in my records. We want these things. Then for these, we can even take them out here. We don't really want to affect all records. Or say for whatever reason we still wanted it to appear there. I can do something like this. I can say a whole if statement wrapped around this. I can say if record.uploader.id is equal to request.session.user_id. Show these options. Then at the end, exactly, our end if right here. And of course, we're still going to see it, but very quickly, let's log out. Bob, Jones, Bobo. Oh my goodness, what is this guy's name? Check it out. Bob can't edit that record in the lower section. Now, when I add this, I can edit this record that I created and that same record that exists in my column. Or if I log out with Bob, what? Okay. I can see that I can edit my records, but not Bob's records. So ownership is very important, right? So I know we went through that quick. Slow that part of the video down. YouTube has a nice little 0.5 speed when I'm talking too fast. Check it out. All right, last thing we want to do, because that's sort of pivoting on foreign keys, being able to use foreign keys to understand if we have permission to something, possibly even saying, get me all of this user's records. We can do that, of course. When we do a sports ORM, especially sports ORM 2, please do it. I did the video for the first one, but please do the second one. We can understand queries and how to get things related. But the final thing we wanted to do is allow a user to hate a specific record, right? So we're going to just put that button on the all records table. We're going to say there's an ahref, go to /hate/.
Should that be outside the if statement?
Oh, it should, absolutely should be, right? Because what happens if it's inside?
Show for users.
It's only if I uploaded it, right? Let's keep that pipe there. We want to, actually we don't even want that option there at all. But for everything, we want to have the pipe here. And then that a tag. ahref/hate/record.id, right? Oh yeah, inside of the, well, I didn't want it inside of the a tag. I want it like this. Oh, whoops, not delete, but hate. So hate. Oh, I see what you're saying. It looks silly if it's out there, huh? Yeah. I mean, we're just splitting hairs at this point, I believe. So I hate when I start with style because then I just get, oh my god, I gotta make it perfect. All right, so hate, right? We can hate either of these records. Ultimately, what we're gonna go for pretty quickly is to try to say when I hate a record, I don't want it to show in either of these tables, but I do want it to show in my hated records. We could even, I tell you what, just make it real weird. Let's keep it in my records because it makes sense to see it there. Let's not have it in all records, and let's show it in the hated records.
Why would you want to upload that record?
That's the problem with these. I don't really think through the system, so I just start doing relations. But I mean, yeah. So let's remove it from both of those. Tim. So let's say when we hate, we go to hate/record_id. URLs, of course, we need to make that. So let's just copy that guy, repurpose it. Hate/record_id. And you kind of notice it gets pretty easy once we have these URL parameters set up in the right way. Most of what we do is based on these same things. Hate/this record. Views, well, actually, views.hate. Def hate, taking in the request as well as the rec_id. We could do the same. If not user ID, in the request.session, well, you have to be signed up to hate things within our system. So return redirect back to the index route. Otherwise, here's where it gets a little weird. What are we trying to affect? A foreign key, a many-to-many, a single column? A many-to-many. Does anyone know how we add or remove from a many-to-many? Okay, gotcha. So when we work with many-to-manys, the way you can envision a many-to-many in memory, it's not actually stored this way in the database, but the easiest parallel is to consider that a many-to-many column almost functions like a list. And I can add the related things into this list. So this record, if I think that it's holding on to a list, it would be a list of users that what? That hate that record, right? So I'm either adding users to this, or I'm removing users from it if they decide they've had a change of heart. So in that sense, there's ways that we add and remove, and it's simply just a .add and a .remove. But it's not a record .add, not a record .move, it's a record .many-to-many name .add, a record .many-to-many name .remove. We're adding or removing from this column in a sense. So for this, record .objects.get, where the ID is the rec ID, dot, what's the column called? Haters, right? With an S. Haters with an S, dot haters, which is the many-to-many column, dot add. And who am I going to add to it?
The user.
The user that clicked it. Exactly, the user in session. And we don't say column equals this or that. We're adding this related entity. User.objects.get, where ID equals the request.session at the user underscore ID. So we're getting a single record. We're targeting its many-to-many column, which is haters, and we're adding to it, almost like a push. And we're adding to it this specific user. Again, if you want to put that user in a variable above and use it there, that's perfectly fine. Whatever way works best for you, but ultimately this is going to add that user to the many-to-many query set that is the haters. And then we return, redirect back to the index. So this is going to allow us to hate things, which is awesome, but all that is for naught unless we can see a change on the website, right? I can make these relations to my heart's content. But if nothing gets affected, if nothing, I say gets affected, because our DB would get updated, all of our data would be proper, but I wouldn't actually see any change on my website right now when I click that button, right? And I can prove that. I can say, hey, I hate BBB. Well, it took me back to index because I'm stupid and I put index instead of main. But if I go back to main, it looks like nothing got changed. In reality, it worked as intended, but I didn't update anything else. What should, aside from fixing the redirect to main, what's up, Kevin?
Add a hate count.
We don't necessarily need a hate count, because, I mean, we could. I could get all the records that I hate. But what should I really do? I wanted to affect the way the queries were working.
Context on the main page.
The context on the main page. That's what shows the data. At the end of the day, that's what makes the system work, right? Having these things filtered or essentially separated based on characteristics. So if I look at the context on the main page, down here, right? Where are we at? There we go. If I look at the context on the main page, if I said that, hey, my records, I didn't want to see it there, right? And also in records, I didn't want to see it there. Let's just start with records. That's kind of the easiest one. What am I going to do to this query to change it to properly remove the records that I have hated? Exclude? Okay. Exclude. What am I excluding?
ID equals the record request.session user ID.
Exclude the records whose ID matches my ID?
No, the record dot hates.
Record.hates?
Yeah, the record dot one key that.
It's a little odd with many-to-manys. What we're trying to essentially say is exclude the records that I have added my user object to in that column, right? If I exist in that set on the record, remove it. I don't want it. Exclude, and it gets a little weird, haters column equals. But this equals in terms of a many-to-many is essentially saying if this next thing is inside of the headers. If it's included in the headers, remove that record. User.objects.get ID equals request.session at user ID. Session. Session. Right? So let's just read that for 1 second. In the records, in this all records query, essentially, I'm going to say get me all of the records, but exclude the records whose headers include this specific user object. This specific user object being my user object in session. Questions?
You also have to send it to the hated list, right?
Exactly. I'll have to show a hated list altogether, but right now we should see something disappear. If I refresh, now we saw the whole website disappear. Request.session. What did I do? Too many parentheses? Oh, I forgot a comma. Dumped it. So, hey, we saw one thing remove, actually, right? If I click this, well, now everything's gone. So be careful, because this will happen. You might go, I just deleted it. No, you didn't delete it. Open your shell. Check out to see if you still have your data, right? Check out your shell. But what happened is they're being excluded properly, right? We excluded these things. However, now we want to basically say, hey, I want to get these back, right? I want to get them back somewhere in a sense. And that somewhere can be in somewhere called hated records. And what's this query set going to be, or this query? I can do record.objects.filter, blah, 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 or I can do user.objects.get, where ID equals the request.session at user_ID. So I've got a user. Dot what? Hated records. Dot related name, right? Dot hated records. I started with the related table. I'm going to use the related name. So get me this single user. Dot hated records. Dot all. We have to run some type of query on it, right? That hated records is representative of a column that is a many-to-many. We have to do a dot all, a dot first, a dot etc. But with our dot all, let's now check out our main. Let's copy paste this table again. Actually, this one. It doesn't matter. All right, let's copy paste that guy. Hated records. We're not going to edit or delete from this one, but we'll just have an unhate. Not a like. We're not getting crazy here. It's just an unhate. All right, so it's going to have the artist, the album, the name, and we're going to change that to hated, right? So hated records is going to run through for every record in hated, print out that artist, that album, that label, and we'll print a button that's going to allow us to unhate that thing. Now, the unhate goes nowhere currently, and actually goes to the same exact place. So we'll say unhate this specific record. And this is going to round it out here because we are running very low on time. Unhate views.unhate, and in views.unhate, also taking a rec ID. And again, our check, if not the user ID, in the request.session. And then we're going to say the same exact thing, return redirect back to index. Otherwise, we essentially want to remove that connection.
The same thing, just copy it and do remove.
Basically, right? The same exact thing. Get this, record.objects.get.haters.remove this specific user. Or if you want to get, different with it, whatever, that's not a phrase. User.objects.getMe, right? ID equals request.session at user_ID. Get this user object, then basically talk about their hated records, .remove or .add. It's the same column. You're just accessing it through the related name or accessing it through the column name, depending on where you started with your query. But right now, it's going to remove it and return redirect right back to main. So let's see if this functionality works, because we can unhate something and hate something. And if we add it, let's add a couple here. Yeah, but we were kind of saying that also you shouldn't upload a record on the website if you want to hate it. Ultimately, we would just have to put that link that exists there, right there.
Log into the other user.
That's exactly what I'm going to do right now, because we were just dumping a ton of records there, If we can remember bob@jones.com. Now we can see, hey, there's all these records I made. Let's delete this guy. It got removed from everywhere. Let's hate this one. That one sucks. This one's whack. This one's weird. We hated all those things. We can unhate all those things.
Patrick, is there any way you can show the code for doing a count on how many this individual
Yeah.
or the other people have hated or something like that?
Yeah, so let's see.
It's literally just
Dot count. Yeah, so let's see. Say on main, we wanted to represent how many times someone had hated. Like, we're going to have a party and just talk about the haters. And then for haters, we'll have a count after actions. We'll say something like TD, and we'll say record dot haters dot all dot count. Yeah, there we go. No, not up here. You're essentially still doing a query up here, but it's not, you can't use the parentheses even if you wanted. So let's just test this. We've got one hater right now. That seems like it's working, but we're not sure. The GHF, whatever that is, logouts, pats, the GHF, whatever that is, hate it, and we have 2 people hating that record now.
You can also do that through the views file.
Yeah, you can get the views count and then put it up there, but honestly, some little,
things are better.
some things are just easier to handle up here.
Okay.
This is going to access that record, talking about its haters column, still running an all query on it. Realize what that's doing. It's still running an all query and simply doing a count on that query. But if I wanted to do something like this too, if you wanted to get real strange, we'll say something like record. Say we wanted to list all the people that hated a specific record. This will be the last thing, because we really do have to cut it after this. Last thing, for hater in, let's all pay attention to this one. Record.objects, actually not even objects, haters.all, right? That's the query that got me all the haters of a record, but I actually counted it. But if I can get that data, I'm essentially doing another query. For each hater in this new query, which got me all of the haters, I can print out the hater. And for, and I can say something like hater.first name, and I can say hater.last name. Yeah, right? But in that way, the biggest takeaway for what I've just done is still having access to the record, because I'm still in that for loop. I can essentially run a query to get all of the haters, all of the related things, right? And I can print all those related things. I can say, hey, Patrick the guy hated this first, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense right now, but Patrick the guy hated the first record, Bob Jones and Patrick the guy hated the second record. That's just my HTML that's being stupid right now. But ultimately, if I unhate this guy, that's what we're looking at. Bob Jones and Patrick the guy have both hated that record. I just have it formatted really dumb right now. But be aware that you can do that, right? We can do what is essentially another query to get the related things to this, right? I can access record.uploader. I can access record.uploader.firstname, record.haters.all, record.haters.first. Cool? We will not have time right now for the views to models transition, but I'll talk about that tomorrow. And we'll use this same existing code base. So we'll work with something we already have and then make that shift. Awesome, guys. I'll start uploading this right now. Thank you.